Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And those of you who listen to this program know about my affinity for rap music, so we're going to start out tonight with a brief report on Kriss Kelly, aka Mac Daddy, of the rap duo Kriss Kross. They had a brief interlude of fame in the early 1990s, and Kriss Kelly died recently at the age of 34. Here's the indefatigable Wolf Blitzer of CNN to talk about Kriss Kelly.
There's sad news to report. Kriss Kelly has died of a possible drug overdose at the age of only 34. Kelly and partner Chris Smith were discovered in 1991 by producer Jermaine Dupri performing at an Atlanta mall. They were only 13 years old at the time, and their music and their style of wearing their clothes backwards became nationally known and widely copied. Showbiz Tonight host AJ Hammer is joining us now from New York.
Even though the song Jump was their only top 10 hit, and it was only one of 4 singles that hit the charts for Kriss Kross, the song was huge. I cannot overstate that. It was the song of the summer of 1992. It spent an incredible 2 months at #1, and Kriss Kelly and his old partner Chris Smith recently even reunited, playing a concert that celebrated the 20th anniversary of their old record label, So Def Records. It was founded by their mentor, Jermaine Dupri. Wolf, I was working on the radio back in the summer of 92 here in New York City, and it was one of those songs where 9 out of 10 people calling up on the request line were saying, you got to play Jump by Kriss Kross. It was that big.
Hey, if you can't overstate how big it was, before closing out on Kriss Kelly, I have to play a little bit of Jump.
Please put your hands together for Kriss Kross performing that hit single, Jump.
Hey, how can 9 out of 10 people be wrong? Some of you may have thought that Steve Jobs was the Mac Daddy, but the real Mac Daddy was Kriss Kelly, and that was just a plug to get you to listen to the Steve Jobs podcast. We're going to move on now to Emil Frei III, who died recently at the age of 89. And Emil Frei III was out of my area, medicine. He was one of the great oncologists of the 20th century. For all intents and purposes, he and his partner Emil Freireich invented combination chemotherapy, and they can be said to have effected one of the first cures of cancer. Their cure for cancer was for childhood leukemia. Before the 1970s, childhood leukemia was virtually universally fatal. They developed combination chemotherapy, which was basically combinations of 4 very potent drugs to combat cancer. And when these drugs were used together, they had a synergistic effect. And within a few years, they were actually able to cure many, if not most, childhood leukemias. And then they went on to use them in other cancers, including osteogenic sarcoma, which is a common bone cancer in children. This was basically unheard of at the time, and it was one of the miracles of 20th century medicine. Here's a brief interview with Emil Frei on combination chemotherapy.
And some of the first things we did were based on laboratory studies of, if you have one agent and 2 agents that are effective separately, can you gain anything by putting them together? In other words, combination chemotherapy. And that was a good choice, too, because it turned out that in acute lymphocytic leukemia in children, the 2 active agents at the time, when put together in our first clinical studies, were synergistic. That is, 1 + 1 made 3 or 4, not just 2. And that got us started. I should say that the theme of combination chemotherapy carries right through to the present time.
That's true. What he says is the basis of most cancer treatment today, the synergistic effect of different cancer-killing drugs used together. The work of Frei and Freireich was groundbreaking. It was published all in major medical journals. I remember reading it when I was a resident and a young attending. Here's a report from the MD Anderson Medical Center, which many people regard as the best cancer center in the United States today, on the work of Frei and Freireich.
Okay, a little background on this, and this is about Emil Frei and Emil Freireich, who played key roles in the conquest of childhood leukemia. This is going back to their first experiments with combination chemotherapy. It also involves Gerald Bodie, who was an infectious disease specialist at MD Anderson. Frei and Freireich revolutionized the treatment of childhood leukemia. The 1955 trial constituted the first ever quantitative, prospective, experimental design for cancer treatment, demonstrating that complete remission after treatment with methotrexate or 6MP, most reliably prognosticated survival. Achieving complete remission quickly became the initial goal. Patients were treated even after that point because of the recognition that it was not possible to be certain that every leukemia cell had been killed. In fact, almost surely they had not. To address the problem of patient relapse and drug resistance, Frei and Freireich 2 years later launched the modern era of combination chemotherapy. For achieving complete remission, combined use of drugs was more effective than one drug used alone. In 1962, Freireich suggested on a creative hunch a 4-drug regimen that soon acquired the acronym VAMP, V-A-M-P, vincristine, methotrexate, 6MP, and prednisone, each administered in a full dose. Freireich guessed that since each drug had a different method of killing leukemia cells, maximum doses could be administered without increasing toxicity. Quote, "At first I opposed it," confessed Gerald Bodie, a specialist in infectious disease. "Giving these kids 4 drugs at once. As a Christian, I thought it was immoral, because if they relapsed, we would have no fallback. I thought Freireich was crazy." The results stunned Bodie. Quote, "We had 16 patients and 11 were cured. It was astonishing. I kept track of one of the children for decades until she died of breast cancer. Frei was awed." Quote, "To be able to do this with a lovely child whom you think of almost as your own is truly an extraordinary experience. I had the evidence that you could succeed," unquote.
When I was a little boy growing up in the early 60s, one of my best friends down the street died very suddenly of childhood leukemia. It made a profound impression on me because it was the first person my age I knew who died. Even today, nearly 50 years later, I think back on it when I ponder the fact that had it been just 10 years later, he'd probably be alive today because of the work of Emil Frei and Emil Freireich. We're going to move on now to Bryan Forbes, who died recently at the age of 86, and Bryan Forbes was a Renaissance man. He was an English film director, but he was also a screenwriter, an actor, and a producer. He was good-looking and articulate. Billy Wilder once said that if you made 5 good films during your career, you had a great career. And Bryan Forbes made a lot of films. Not all of them were good, but he did make probably 5 really good ones. He's best known in the United States for the Stepford Wives, which he made in 1975. Stepford Wives was based on a novel by Ira Levin, and the screenplay was by William Goldman, so you can't get any better pedigree than that. It starred Catherine Ross in one of her last films, and Paula Prentice, Northwestern girl, who I really liked. It's not a great film, but it's a good film, and it's ingrained in the American conscience because of its subject, a bunch of robotic Connecticut housewives. He was the screenwriter for a great 1960 movie called A League of Gentlemen with Jack Hawkins. I urge you to check that one out. It's a great movie. In Britain, he did The L-Shaped Room with Leslie Caron, which was one of the kitchen sink movies. He did Seance on a Wet Afternoon. But his best movie, in all likelihood, in Britain was a movie called Whistle Down the Wind, which he did in 1961. It's about a bunch of rural children who've come upon an escaped convict, Alan Bates, and they believe that he's Jesus. One of the children was Haley Mills, and Haley Mills gave an interview to the BBC4's Last Word, talking about Bryan Forbes.
"I always felt that we were close friends. I saw him a lot when I was a child. They used to come down for weekends, the country, and then Bryan directed me in the film Whistle Down the Wind, which was taken from the book that my mother wrote of that name. It was very fortunate that he directed that movie because he was wonderful with actors, having been, and still being an actor himself. It was quite an uncomfortable film to make because it was all on location in Lancashire, on this very remote farm at the foot of the Pendle Hills.
"That ain't Jesus." "Well, it is then, Mr. Cleverdick. Jesus wore a long dress. Well, that was in them days. And listen, it's a secret. You're not to tell anyone, because we don't know yet what he wants us to do."
It was a wonderful experience because Bryan and Nanette were there a lot, and my mother and father, of course, and Richard Attenborough, who was the producer. There was a lot of wine flowed, a lot of fun, a lot of jokes. Of course, he was also a very, very good, clever, talented writer.
They were all ex-army officers, but beyond that, they had only 2 things in common: a guilty past and a hopeless future. They had nothing to lose by joining The League of Gentlemen.
It wasn't a surprise he went to Hollywood. I mean, he was a very talented man.
I was frightened, and yet I wanted to accept the challenge because I think if you're a Catholic, you have to go to Rome once, and Hollywood is really Genesis where the film industry is concerned.
Joanna, I think that's what's going on in Stepford. I think there's something in the water that turns us into housefrows, drones, whatever you want to call it.
He was a very lucky man. He had a lot of passions that he was able to pursue. But embodied in that not large frame was tremendous energy, tremendous warmth, tremendous enthusiasm. Even when I last saw him, he was still cracking jokes and, taking serious life very lightly.
That's another one you should check out if you get a chance. Bryan Forbes, Whistle Down the Wind. We're going to close tonight with Deanna Durbin, who died recently at the age of 91. And Deanna Durbin's name is not known to most people today, but in the 1930s and 1940s, she was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. In fact, in 1947, she was the highest paid female star in Hollywood. Deanna Durbin was born in Canada, and I like to think of her as the Canadian Judy Garland. And in fact, she started out at MGM with Judy Garland. She had the same type of ability. She could sing, she could dance, and she could act. The problem was she couldn't sing quite as good or dance quite as well or act quite as well as Judy Garland. But then again, probably no one, male or female, could do that. So that when Louis Mayer had to decide between the two, he had to pick Judy Garland, and Deanna Durbin went to Universal. Here's Judy's daughter, Liza Minnelli, telling about one of the first pairings between Judy Garland and Deanna Durbin at MGM.
They paired her off with an operatic singer named Deanna Durbin.
So Universal got a huge talent, and in fact, Deanna Durbin rescued the studio from financial distress with some of her mid-40s pictures. Here's Matthew Bannister from the BBC4's Last Word on Deanna Durbin.
The wholesome young star shot to fame as a teenager in the 1930s and then appeared in a string of musical comedies which made the most of her sweet singing voice and vivacious personality. Deanna had been born Edna Mae Durbin in the Canadian city of Winnipeg. Her parents moved to California when she was a baby, and she began taking voice lessons at the age of 8. The film writer Karen Krisanovich says she was discovered by the studio system when she was 14.
Louis Mayer took her and put her in a short with Judy Garland. He didn't like her. The public really did, and so she went on to Universal. And there, with her coming career, she did great, great work for Universal during a time when people wanted to be distracted from the woes of the Depression and the coming war.
She wasn't just popular in America, she had an international following, didn't she?
She had a huge international following. Apparently, Winston Churchill used to see her films before they were released. Benito Mussolini also liked her. And Anne Frank had a picture of her on her wall.
So, and Frank had a picture on her wall.
Yes, quite famously, yes. So she was a woman who was adored, and not only because of her wholesome image, but I think she gave people something to hope for. We may see this as schmaltzy, corniness, not at all realistic, but living through the horrors of the Depression and World War II, it was a really nice bit of denial that Deanna Durbin supplied.
So what are the films that really made her a big star?
Well, her first film was Three Smart Girls.
Daddy! Hello, Doc. Oh, I thought you'd never get home.
So did I. Hello, Judson.
And what was her appeal to people in those films?
She was the obedient, wholesome girl. She wasn't problematic. She wasn't complicated. I read a quote from her. She said that she was the wholesome daughter when people at home were struggling with their own. She was the ideal.
Nice?
Lovely. Simply lovely.
Who's your boyfriend tonight?
Same one. You?
And of course, as she grew older, presumably this role as the wholesome daughter began to chafe with her.
The problem, and this is still a problem with Hollywood, it's very difficult for stars to reinvent themselves, to move away from what they were successful as. Deanna Durbin was this wholesome, wonderful daughter star who naturally wanted to grow up.
I look very grown up tonight, don't I, Senator?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. You're still just a little girl to me.
Oh, really?
Remember when I used to dance you on my knee?
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
She wanted to play different roles and not just singing, not just comedy. So they were developing several projects for her to be more of an adult and to move into a successful actress role. And she really wasn't comfortable. A good example of that is 1944's Christmas Holiday, where she starred as a nightclub hostess opposite Gene Kelly, who was a killer. They're both cast against type.
I've been holding on to you all the time. I love you.
You know what I think? Anybody that loves as much as you do is entitled to a reward.
And it just didn't wash. Some people can pull it off. It's very, very difficult. And Deanna didn't. And in fact, the box office failure of her final films were really what made her give up the business. She retired in 1950 at the age of 29. She was saying that she considered her big salary, which was 17% of Universal's income during the 30s, as compensation for poor quality material. And she very happily became, as she signed one of her letters, the globe-trotting recluse for the rest of her life.
Well, here you get your Hollywood irony. She broke in with Judy Garland, and Judy Garland became the much bigger star. But by the early 1950s, Judy Garland was used and abused by the studio system, and she was already showing the strains of it physically and mentally. Whereas Deanna Durbin left Hollywood studio system. She traveled around the world. She had a lot of money. She got a villa in France. For a while, she lived next to Ayatollah Khomeini when he lived in France. And Deanna Durbin had a relatively happy life outside the spotlight for over 50 years. Judy Garland, on the other hand, had a tragic life, and she died in the late 1960s. So all of you who are interested in the vagaries of Hollywood fame can choose. Judy Garland and Deanna Durbin were born within 6 months of each other. Judy Garland, who's still well remembered today but died young and broken, or Deanna Durbin, who lived a rich, full life but is basically forgotten today by all but the most diehard movie fans. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And how can we close tonight with anything but a Deanna Durbin performance? Here she is with her beautiful voice singing Londonderry Air, also known as Oh Danny Boy. This is when she was at the height of her popularity in 1946 from the movie Because of Him, co-starring Franchette Tone and Charles Lawton. She may not have been Judy Garland, but she sure could sing.